Hi, welcome everyone to our Macro Magic Ease webinar. I'm joined today by Jennifer Yankopolus and Paul Beverley, who will be talking to us about word macro tools. Hi, Jennifer. Paul, how are you today? Hey, thanks for joining us.
Yep, all good.
Hello.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks for doing this today. I am moderating today's session. For those that don't know me, I'm Duncan Nicholas, past president of Ease. Jennifer will be kind of leading the session, and Paul will be on hand, in his words, in a consultancy capacity. He might be keeping an eye on the chat as well, but he'll be fielding questions from everyone during the session as Jennifer takes us through the main presentation. Feel free to share any screenshots and comments on social media using hashtag #EaseEvents and our handle #EaseEditors on whichever social media platform you might be on now. There's quite a few to keep up with. So that's kind of my housekeeping. So I shall begin today's session. Welcome to our Macro Magic Ease member webinar. I'm joined today by Jennifer Yankopolus and Paul Beverley. Paul has spent 20 years or more editing and typesetting his own monthly computer magazine, then 16 years of providing freelance editing, which during that time he developed a wide range of editing tools in Visual Basic for Word, first for his own use and then expanding them to his colleagues around the UK. And he now has, a website with training materials, word macro tools, which also links to his YouTube channel. Jennifer is an editor with over 20 years of editing experience, specializing in architecture and design. And she's worked with designers, firms, nonprofits, historians, and authors through World Collaborative. She's an instructor at the University of California, San Diego Copyediting Certificate Program and helps editors become more efficient macro users with webinars, courses, and the Macro of the Month newsletter. So it is something of a treat to receive their expertise today. And with that, I'll hand over to Jennifer and Paul to take us through the session today. Thank you. Over to you.
Great, thanks, Duncan. We appreciate you inviting us here. And I always want to extend a big thanks to Paul for, first of all, making all these macros available to all of us around the world to use, and also for being my sidekick in these presentations. We always have quite a bit of fun doing these presentations together. So as the name of this webinar suggests, I'm here to tell you about the magic of macros to help you become a more efficient editor. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and start the presentation. So just give me a moment to get that set up. Okay, here we go. So first, let's just start. Oops, you didn't see that. It was a mistake. We are going to start off just talking about the agenda today. And it's going to be centered around the common questions that people have about macros. So first, we'll just talk simply about what macros are. And then we'll move into why editors use macros. But we're going to spend the bulk of the presentation talking about how macros can increase your productivity. And actually not really talking, I'm going to be showing you. I could talk all day about macros and try to describe them to you, but really me demonstrating a whole handful will serve you much better than words can just explain them. And then we'll close off by talking about how you can get started using macros, and we'll share some resources for that. And then we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. But you feel free if you want to put questions in the chat as I'm talking, or also in that Q&A box. Paul will be monitoring that, but of course we'll have time for questions at the end. Also, if you use macros, if you want to share that information with us, or if you don't use macros, but you're curious and you want to tell us what you know about macros or why you want to learn macros, feel free to share that information for us in the chat. We always like to learn about where people are at with this topic. All right, well, let's get started. Oops. What is a macro? Well, very simply, a macro is a tool. And as editors, we use all types of tools, right? We use dictionaries, style guides, even spell check in Word is a tool. Perfectit's another tool that a lot of editors use. And so a macro is just another tool that you can add to the set of tools that you already use. So a macro is designed, a single macro designed to perform a single task. They can help us make copy edits, fact check, can check for consistency, and other tasks. If we want to get even more specific, we can say that a macro is a small computer program designed in the Visual Basic language that's installed inside of Microsoft Word. And for those of you that are curious or technical minded, here is actually a sample of a single macro. This is the actual computer code. But for those of you that are starting to get nervous, I want to reinforce that no technical knowledge is needed to use macros. First of all, Paul Beverley has created a whole library of over 1,200 macros for us to use for free. And since he's an editor himself, these macros are all designed to help with the editing tasks that we all face daily. So we don't need to know anything about computer programming. I don't know anything about computer programming. Frankly, this text here, this computer code, it looks a lot like gibberish to me. And so you don't need to know any of this. I mean, you certainly can program your own macros if you're so inclined. But here today, we are going to be talking solely about Paul Beverley's library of pre-programmed macros. So we can just get on with our work as editors and do it more efficiently. So let's now talk about why do editors use macros? Well, like any tool, right? Macros or any tool that we use, we want to increase our efficiency. And then macros do that as well. That's because they're performing some of these tasks. For instance, changing the capitalization of a word or spelling out a number. It's automating those through the computer. And so the computer can do it more quickly than we can do manually by deleting and typing on our keyboard. Macros can also help to increase our accuracy. There's a whole host of macros that help us deal with consistency checking. And the computer is really good at crunching through a whole lot of numbers or, excuse me, data in a document to find inconsistencies. And it can just do that a lot more quickly than we can do that manually. And we'll get a sense of that later when I'm demonstrating some of these macros. And then lastly, but no less important than these other categories, is that macros can help to reduce repetitive strain injuries. That's because we're transferring some of the work of executing an edit onto the macro. And so that means that we are reducing the amount that we need to use the mouse and the keyboard. So another way to think about macros is a collaboration between your editorial judgment and your computer. So I don't want you to get worried by this statement. I'm not suggesting that the computer is going to be like maybe some of the AI tools that we're seeing. There's no hallucination. There's nothing we have to worry about the macros doing on their own. Your editorial judgment is still paramount. You decide when an edit needs to be made, and then you run the macro to make that edit. So the pairing between the two parties here, you and your computer, can make your work experience quicker, and I would like to say more fun too. And I'll show you some of the fun things coming up. Okay, so we're on to our next question here. This is where we're going to spend most of our time today, and that's how macros can increase your productivity. So I'm going to demonstrate a couple different types of macros, so you can start to see how they could be useful in your work. And we'll have plenty of time in the Q&A if you want. If you see some of these macros and you get inspired and you think, oh, I wonder if there's a macro for this or that, we can certainly talk about that in a Q&A and help you find one that would be helpful for your situation. So the first type of macro I want to show you is ones that are used to help you fact check using the internet. So in other words, when we're editing, we're often looking up kinds of words, right? We're looking up words in dictionaries. We're using Google a lot and other different types of online searchable reference databases. And so there's a whole bunch of macros that make that process easier. The one I want to focus on today is called Google Fetch. And this helps us do a search of Google. So here we have some sample text, and we're editing along, and we're reading according to figures culled from public Ethereum blockchain data. And we instantly pause on that word Ethereum and wonder, is it spelled correctly? Is it capitalized correctly? I have no idea. I've never run across this word before. So normally what would I do? I would select this word by dragging my mouse across it. I would copy it, which I'm just using a keyboard shortcut so you can't see that. Right? I jump over to my browser and I pull up my Google window, and then I paste that word in there and I hit return. And I've got my Google results that I can look through. So I'm gonna close this so that you can see the actual magic. So I have no Google window open over here on my browser tab. And let me go back to the document here. And this time I'm going to use the Google Fetch macro to do that. And anytime I run a macro, I use a keyboard shortcut. So you may be already familiar with keyboard shortcuts, right? We've got very common ones like Control S to save, or it'd be Command S if you're on a Mac, and to print, Control P or Command P if you're on a Mac. And so I'm simply just using a keyboard shortcut that I've assigned to Google Fetch. And I'm going to do that same. I'm going to look up this word in Google, and I'm going to run my keyboard shortcut right now. And look at that. It condensed all of those steps that I performed earlier manually into just one step for me having to run that keyboard shortcut. So I think you can see how much quicker that was to execute this search. It also required less effort on my hand and wrist because I wasn't dragging the mouse over that word and having to copy it with another keyboard shortcut and then jump over here and so on. So there are, like I said earlier, there are a bunch of other macros that can help you search all types of databases: dictionary thesaurus, PubMed, WorldCat, Google Scholar, and so on. I'm not going to demonstrate these because they all work the same. Basically, you've got a word or set of words you want to look up, and you use the macro to do it, and it just makes it almost instantaneous. And later in the presentation, we'll point out to you where you can find these types of macros. So now I want to move on to a different type of macro, and that is ones that help us to make copy edits. And this is the largest category of macros that Paul has created. And that's just because as editors, that's a lot of what we do every day, right? We're fixing punctuation marks and capitalization and numbers. And a lot of these small, but very important edits we're doing every day. And so there's quite a number of these macros to help us do that. The first one is called case this word. And as the name implies, this helps us to deal with capitalization. All macro names kind of sound a little weird because they can't have any spaces in them and you don't want to make them too long. So you can see we've got case this word where we've got all the information smushed together with internal capitalization to help us help us discern what the name is more easily. Okay, so let's look at this in practice. So here we're editing along in our document and we run across this word Ethereum again, but we know because we looked it up earlier in the document that it should be capitalized. And here it's that capitalization is incorrect. So we know we need to go in there and fix that capitalization. So normally what I would do is I would simply place that cursor there right after the E, and then I would just delete it. And I'm just using the delete key here. And then I would just type the capital E. And then I would pause and fix my typo, which I fortunately make typos more often than I wish I did. So that's how I would do it manually. Now I'm going to take it back to the lowercase, and let's look at how we would do this if we were to use this macro. But first, I want to add another element to our presentation here, and that's over on this the right-hand side. I'm going to be using keyboard shortcuts to run all these macros, but you can't see my keyboard. So I want to make sure that I'm making the connection for you of what I'm doing is happening on the screen because I'm running a macro. I'm not doing it manually. And so on the right-hand screen, every time I run a macro, that macro name is going to pop up. So you can start to associate the macro with what's happening on the screen. Okay, so here we are. We've got founded in 2013 Ethereum. And I instantly pause and I know I need to change the capitalization. And I'm going to go down to my keyboard and run the shortcut right now. There you go. And you can see it capitalized the word for me. Very quickly, it condensed all those steps that I would do manually into doing it almost instantly. And better yet, it doesn't make any typos. Let's look at one more example here. We've got NFT stands for non-fungible token. Well, first of all, is non-fungible, is that spelled correctly or, should it be capitalized? I don't know. So I can also use Google Fetch here for all these words. I think I didn't point out earlier, if you have a single word, you just need the cursor inside that word and to run it. So you don't even have to take that extra step of selecting it. But when you have multiple words, it can't read your mind. So you have to select all the words and then run your shortcut to look it up. And let's just say that we've looked at our search results and we're confident with that this needs to be lowercase. So I'm going to run the macro. And again, I'm not actually having to select the word non. As long as the cursor is inside the word, that's enough information for the macro to know what we want it to do. And this part is the really fun part because I'm going to run the shortcut once, twice, 3 times in a row. You can see how it zooms through those words really quickly to change that capitalization. I always get a little jolt. I think that's really fun that it can do that so quickly. Well, I'm sure you astute editors are thinking to yourself, well, wait, shouldn't non-fungible be hyphenated? And as you might guess, there is a macro that will do that called punctuation to hyphen. And I'm actually now going to turn on track changes because I want to reinforce to you that anytime you have track changes turned on, the macros will track the edit or word will track the edit. So I've turned track changes on and I need to punctuate this word. So I simply place the cursor in the first word of the word pair so that the macro knows which words I want to be hyphenated. And I run my shortcut right now. And there you go. You can see it deleted that space and it put a hyphen in its place. Well, besides adding punctuation or changing punctuation, sometimes we have to delete punctuation that shouldn't be there, right? So here we have the article explains what non-fungible tokens are. So we're working with an author who's very fond of using quotation marks around terms, especially new terms, and we need to remove those. Well, I'm sure you already can imagine what having to do that manually would be. It would be quite a number of steps to place the cursor very specific spot right after each of those quotation marks and delete it. Or I simply can run the macro, and this macro is smart. It knows what a punctuation mark is, so I don't even have to be that precise about where I place the cursor. If I'm reading along in the sentence and my kind of peripheral vision is already seeing, I got these quotation marks I got to get rid of. Wherever you are, wherever the cursor is, right now it's standing inside the word article, I can just run it once and twice, and you can see it deletes both of those punctuation marks for me. But I should point out that it did not delete that hyphen, so it's designed to jump over the hyphens for situations like this. And just to reinforce that punctuation off can deal with all types of punctuation marks. And here we have a comma that it will delete. Again, of course, it does skip over the hyphens, but otherwise it deals with most punctuation marks. So I've got to get rid of that is after non-fungible, after non-fungible token. And if I were to get a little bit too sprightly with my keyword shortcuts, if I ran it one more time, it would actually delete that sentence ending punctuation there. So you do have to be careful when you're running that. Well, let's talk about characters. So here we've got some equations, and we've got a couple of different things going on here. First of all, we can see that the author used an X instead of a multiplication symbol, so we know we need to fix that. But then now I'm wondering, is this character, is that a minus sign? Is that an N dash? I'm not sure. So we can use whatchar, which stands for what character, to tell us what that is. So I run whatchar and it brings up this little window. I hope you can see it. I wish I could make it bigger. But it says here that we have an N dash. So we, in fact, do not have a multiplication symbol. And we can certainly see that this is too short. That's a hyphen. And I can run whatchar one more time on this one just to see, yeah, that's also an N dash. And just for fun, since we're here, I know we can all probably tell by sight that that X is incorrect, but let's just run it. And we see we have a lowercase x. So we need to take care of these marks. And so we've got two macros that will help us deal with that. So I'm going to run the punctuation to multiply sign that will change this X to an actual multiplication sign. So I'm just going to run the shortcut right now. And you can see it changed that. And then I don't even have to move the cursor because, again, it knows punctuation minus will change any hyphen or N dash into a true minus sign. And so I'm going to run that one right now. And you can see, which is weird, that actually did not track the change, huh? But let's go back and use our whatchar. And you can see it says a proper minus sign. So that's interesting. It didn't track that. Maybe I have something set in the macro.
Jennifer, it's an option in the macro.
Okay.
You can set it at the beginning either to track all the changes or not to, because you may not want to track the fact that you've corrected the minus signs.
Okay, that's a good point to say. First of all, I don't deal with these types of signs, so I don't. So yeah. This is really the only time I'm using this macro, so I don't know that. But that's also a good point that there are some features that Paul builds into these macros, including this, where sometimes you don't want to track some of these very straightforward, indisputable edits, and so you can go into the macro code and at the top, and you could tell it to not track the change. So those are some really nice features that Paul builds into everything that he has. All right, well, we still have this hyphen that we need to get rid of. So I'm going to run the macro again. And you can see here we've got the minus, now the true minus sign. I'll just do that real quick to show you. We've got proper minus sign. Okay. So let's just look at that one more time and let's just kind of see how fast you can do this. So I'm just going to run through these different shortcuts and I'm going to just take care of this line really quickly. You can see, like, you can, once you have these macros memorized, you can zip through a lot of edits very quickly. Well, I could spend all day showing you more of these types of macros, which would be really fun because there's quite a lot of great ones. But given our time today, I just want to let you know, I'm going to stop here with these types of macros, but there are other macros that deal with all types of other punctuation marks and deleting text and dealing with accented letters and numbers and a whole lot more. I just want to point out some of the key points here. And that is that if you think back to what we did, that we used a different macro for each task. So each macro can do one thing and one thing only. And the macros only run when you tell them to, right? So the macros only did something when I used a keyboard shortcut to run it. Otherwise, I like to think of them as they're just sitting in the back room having coffee, waiting until I call them up to do a task for me. So you don't have to worry about macros making global errors throughout a document that you won't be able to catch. And of course, keyboard shortcuts are essential. Every single macro that I ran, I used a keyboard shortcut to use. And also I want to point out that macros work the same on a PC and Mac. I happen to be demonstrating on a Mac today, but if I were using a PC, the presentation would be no different. There are some differences when you go to install the macros, and that's just simply because the menus are arranged differently between a Mac and a PC. But otherwise, on a day-to-day basis, there's no difference. All right, well, let's look at a different type of macro, and these are ones that help us check for consistency. And these are called analysis macros. And they work differently than the ones that we've seen. These macros, we run them before we begin editing, and we run them on the entire document because it's doing an analysis of the information in the text. It's not making actually any changes. So we use these to help us identify consistency errors before we begin working on a project, right? So we can clean up these errors before we begin working. So I want to emphasize that these are analysis macros. They provide us information about potential inconsistencies, but it does not correct them. We can also use this information to help us populate our style sheet. And for those of you who use Perfected, this macro works really well with Perfected. Now, Perfected will also check for consistency, and it will make the change for you. But many editors who use Perfected also use macros. I mean, first of all, there's plenty of more macros that do all kinds of things that Perfected doesn't. But also, no software is perfect. So people who use Perfected and macros will oftentimes use Perfected before they begin a project. And then they might run these analysis macros at the end of a project to double check to make sure nothing got missed or nothing was introduced during revisions, particularly if you're trading the file back and forth with the author. Or sometimes people might run these analysis macros before they run Perfected and clean up the errors, so that way Perfected will run more quickly as well. The first one I want to talk to you about is called ProperNounAlyse, and it helps us to find inconsistencies among proper nouns. So like I said, you run this macro on your entire document before you begin working. Now, I'm not going to actually run the macro because I don't want to sitting here for a few minutes just watching the computer do its thing. So I'm going to show you the results. So each of these analysis macros will give you a report that points out, again, potential inconsistencies. And here's a sample of what the proper noun queries report looks like. It basically gives you a list of word pairs, and it uses highlighting to make sure you know which word pairs it wants you to compare to see if there are problems. And then that's where the value of the macro ends. So a macro brain, so to speak, works differently than a human's brain. The macro can crunch through a whole bunch of different data, and in this case, pull out all the proper nouns, compare them, and run a lot of tests on them to see where there might be problems. But that's where it ends. And then that's where the human has to come in, because we're really good at understanding context. And even just scanning down a list like this, we can already quickly start to see where there might actually be errors. So we come in and we look through this report and we do an analysis and to figure out which are actual errors. In the first set, we've got America with 11 instances and American with 5. Well, we know, right, from our training and that there's not an error here. A document would have both of these words in them. And so we don't think there's going to be a problem there. So we move on to the next category, and we have 2 instances of Fraser with an S and 28 with a Z. And our red flags are really going out thinking, yeah, there's probably an error here. Of course, we want to investigate it in the document, but this is definitely a good candidate for something that we need to look at. And then we have Perez with 1 instance with an accented E and 19 without. And again, most likely this will be something that needs to be made consistent. Although in this case, perhaps the accented E is the correct answer, and the author just simply didn't know how to make an accented E, and so we have 19 without. But nonetheless, this will be something that we need to investigate. So all these analysis macros are great because they give us all this type of information that we can use to catch all these things. That way we can clean them up before we begin working on a project, and we don't have to then always be trying to worry that we're trying to look for these names as we're going throughout. It's much more efficient, but also higher chance of catching these errors when we do it this more analytical way than when we're just reading through the document as we're editing. One other type of analysis macro that I want to show you is called CitationAlyse, and this helps us find inconsistencies between in-text citations and references. This is a fantastic macro that saves so much time instead of you doing the comparison manually, relying on the computer to do the comparison. And then just like with ProperNounAlyse, you're going through and looking at the results of what is given you. Once again, I'm not going to run the macro because I don't want us to just sit here and stare at my screen, but let me just bring up a report and I will show you how it works, how to analyze the report. So here we have our citation query list. So it basically pulls out every in-text citation and every reference, and it compares them based on the year. And then it puts them all together in these pairs based on the year. So here in this first set, we have Ramsey 1938, which is the citation, and then we've got the Ramsey GF 1938, which is the reference entry. And we look at both of these, the year and then the author name spelling seems fine, no problem, move on to the next one. Same thing here, we've got Low 1942 in both instances, and there is no issue here. But we get down here to, we've got Lowenfeld 1947, but then we have Lowenfield 1947. So here we clearly have an error that we need to fix. And then our next set here, we've got Larrabee 1968, who's all by himself. There is no reference list entry paired with it. But we do have a Larrabee 1969. So we also know here that there's probably the mistake in the year between one of these two. And then similarly here, we have a Newsom and Silver, and we've got a 1972, then we've got 1978 here. So most likely this 1972 should be 78, or maybe there's a missing reference entry for the 1972 article. So once again, we'll just need to research that. So you can see this can be quite a time saver than you having to kind of like manually go back and forth between the citations and the reference entries. I know that when I don't work with references too often, but when I do, this thing is such a time saver. It still blows my mind. Magical, you could say. Okay. Well, we have, there's a whole bunch of other popular consistency checking macros. We've got ones that deal with hyphenation. That's a very, very commonly used one. Spelling, how centuries are written, capitalization, and a whole lot more. And again, we'll give you the link to where all these macros are stored. And then I briefly want to talk to you about the fact that we've kind of gone through three of the main categories of the types of macros, the ones that help us look up information online, the ones that help us do copy edits, and then these ones that help us find inconsistency by analyzing the documents. But there's a whole bunch of more macros because as editors, we do a whole lot more, don't we? There's macros that can do perform more kinds of things than I can really say. There are 1,200 macros, so I don't really know how to quite summarize all that, but just to think that anytime you're working and you're doing a tedious task and you're like, oh my goodness, how much more do I have to keep doing this task? Well, you might want to pause and go, there might be a macro to help me with this task, and most likely there is. In fact, one project I had recently, somehow the author had managed to put a space before every single footnote, and of course that's a very superscripted space, and the thought of trying to get that cursor right in that spot, that one little teeny spot to delete that space and do it throughout the entire document was horrible. But when I went to look if there was a macro, wouldn't you know it, there was a macro, and with one fell swoop of running that macro, it took care of all those issues for me, all those spaces for me. But one macro that I do want to demonstrate, because it's been quite a popular one, it's one I just featured in my newsletter and everybody really seems to love it, and it's called copy to list alphabetic. And this one will populate your style sheet. So it will copy a word from the document you're editing, and it will paste it into your style sheet in the word list section of your style sheet in alphabetical order. Now, if that's not magical, I don't know what is. So let me bring up some text here to show you how that works. So here I've got a style sheet. And here I've just got some sample text. And if you notice on the style sheet here, I've got all kinds of things, sections about abbreviations, colons, and whatnot. And then I've got my word list down here, right? But because I want you to really understand that macros are magical, I'm going to put the cursor up here in the abbreviation section, right? So I'm not even putting the cursor in the word list. And then I'm going to go over to my, my document, and I'm going to run the shortcut to copy the word Fraser into my style sheet. And look at that. Look over here. The cursor was up here in the abbreviation section, but the word ended up down here in the word list. Now, is that not a miracle? And then I'm going to add the word Bodine there. And look at that. It put it in correct in alphabetical order. Now, for even more magic, I'm actually going to hide that style sheet, and we're going to add a few more things. I'm going to add Atlanta, Griffin, and Lamberson. Oh, and then for good measure, let's do Tuxedo Park. In most cases, you just put the cursor in the word, but when you have more than one, you have to select it. And let's go back over here to my style sheet. Look, it copied all of those words on there in alphabetical order, but even better yet, when I had the style sheet hidden, it still copied it, and it didn't even disrupt my flow, right? When we're adding a word to our style sheet manually, you're having to pause, copy it, go over to your style sheet, find the right area, and paste it in. That takes a lot of your attention away from the flow of editing. But when you use this macro, and you can keep the style sheet, it has to be open, but if you can keep it on a second screen, or you can keep it behind all your other documents, you don't even know that it's happening. So you are barely having any disruption to your flow of editing, because you're just really quickly running that shortcut, and then you can just keep going with what you're doing. So it really minimizes distractions. All right, well, I would love to show you even more macros, but I think you hopefully starting to get a sense of the possibilities, at least some of the possibilities of what these macros can do. So, oops, wrong thing. So as I said, you can find, and I will paste this into the chat. You can find all of Paul's macros in the macro menu. So this is simply just a list of all of 1,200 macros. But they're all organized by categories. So it's easier for you if you know you want to like look up something online, you can go to the internet category and you could find something for, the PubMed or on Google Scholar or things like that. And you can also search it too. So if you wanted to look for a macro that dealt with commas, you can just search for comma, and then you could scroll through and find some candidates for that. And next, lastly, just want to talk to you about how you can learn macros if you're interested. One of the best ways is that Paul and I created this free macros from square one self-tutoring guide. So basically, it teaches you everything you need to know about how to install macros, how to assign them keyboard shortcuts. It even walks you through a couple macros for you to try. There's practice exercises so you can try these different macros out. It teaches you how to use the ProperNounAlyse, which I know I talked about briefly, but it gives you a chance to learn about that a little more in depth. It shows you how to use that macro menu to find more macros and suggest some other common ones that you might want to use based on what macros are popular among editors. And I'll paste a link to that in the document or in the chat and here in a moment. Also, if you want to go in even more depth, I do a macros A to Z, a 6-week class through the Editorial Freelancers Association. So that walks you through everything, installing macros, and I walk you through methodically many of the different categories of macros, including teaching you how to use Fredit, which is a global find and replace macro, which is very powerful and very helpful, but is a little more of an intermediate macro that takes time to learn how to use. The next one is starting in July, and I'll post that also in the chat. And just also, again, some which Duncan mentioned in the beginning, but Paul's website is wordmacrotools.com, and that's also where the macro menu is housed, but he also has other resources and information there. And then also my macro of the month newsletter, which will show you how to use one new macro each month. So last month, in fact, I featured the copy to list alphabetic, and that one's probably been my most popular newsletter and since I've been running it for the last 3 years, because it is so helpful for people. Just want to give a premature thank you because we are going to stop for questions in a moment, but also we have our email addresses here, and I'm going to post all that in the Oh, I see Paul has already posted some of these things here. And also I've prepared a handout that has all these links in them and also has links to each of the macros that I've demonstrated. So I will send that to Duncan and Mary, and then that can get distributed to everybody who's attending. So you have everything in one place instead of trying to furiously copy all these links from the chat. So with that, I am going to stop sharing and open it up to everybody for questions. I mean, Paul, is there any questions that came in that we want to discuss?
Nothing obvious, but I would like to point out that there's a new feature in Google Fetch and also in Copy to List Alphabetic. You don't need to select multiple words. Click in the first word and then shift click in the last word approximately. You don't need to do it accurately, just somewhere in the first word. Shift click somewhere in the last word and then run the macro, and it says, oh, you mean the whole of that word and the whole of that word, and then it sends that off to Google Fetch or sends it across to your word list. So extra feature for you.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
I mean, this is what happens. People feedback and say, you know, it would be better if your macro did, you know, could your macro also do such and such? And it's good fun just adding those extra features, especially if they cut down the amount of mouse use and just allow more on the keystrokes, the less chance of RSI.
Yeah, Alice, I saw your question about the 6-week course and how much it costs. I'm putting the link here to it in the materials, and it's run through EFA, but like members of CIEP and some of the other editing organizations get a discount. So off the top of my head, I think it's like $350 US without the discount from your editing organization. And you just need to edit. You just need to ask your editing organization for the code. Like there's a code each group gives out that you put in when you register. But you can always contact me if you have questions about that. And then here, let me put the macro from Square One documents in the chat, the links where you can get those. They're just Word documents that we'll download. Also, I guess we'll do them one at a time. I should say though, I neglected to say that, oh, they're all in there. Okay. That you need to use, there's ones for Mac and PC because again, the install instructions are different for both platforms. And thanks to some editors in Spain, we also have Spanish language versions of those. So I put all that in the chat. And again, I'll put these links in the handout that I will give you guys. The other thing, I guess, Paul, I didn't mention, which I meant to, was that a lot of the macros are language independent, right? A comma is a comma in whatever language you're in. And there are some specific, I know particularly Netherlands or Dutch and maybe some German macros, the people that have contacted you from those countries and asked if, hey, can you make this numbers macro work for our language? And so there's those available.
Yeah, and some Spanish ones as well.
And let's see, what's the other thing I wanted to, oh, so this one might be for you, Paul. If there's some resources to find macro templates or resources to create your own.
Templates is not something that I've used. I just put the macros in the normal template and use them. So they don't need to be anywhere other than in the normal template, because once they're there, they're accessible from any document that you're working on. So in sort of 18 years as a freelance editor, I've never used templates. So it's an area I don't know about, sorry.
If you give me a moment here, let me pull up. I know that there are, I mean, I just use Paul's macros because, I don't have probably learning to code my own it would be a stretch, but I also know that there are, there is the Jack Line, who's an editor in, I believe, the US or possibly Canada. He has a book called the Macro Cookbook for Microsoft Word. And so that also kind of gives you a good starting points there to program your own.
If you look
And
on
then-
my website, there's a resources tab, and that sort of thing is in the resources tab, links to various sources of information to do with macros and so on. Someone's asking about keystrokes. Do you define the keystrokes? Yes, very much so. If you want a keystroke for a macro, you need to use a keystroke that you will remember. And therefore, it's up to you to decide what keystroke to use for any given macro. What's intuitive to you, that's what you should use. So yes, you define the macros, the keystrokes to go with the relevant macros.
Yeah, and I did just put in a few links to, there's 2 courses. One's on Udemy, Udemy, I don't know how you say that. That one's not, it's a self-guided class, so there's no teacher there. But then there's also another one that Alan Wyatt does about once a year, that he teaches you how to program macros, and the teacher is involved. So there's those resources. And I don't know if anybody's tried like ChatGPT, but you can use ChatGPT and some others to also help you program macros. But we've had really mixed results with that. I used it as a test to try one, and man, it got really sassy with me.
Use this artificial intelligence, please.
Yes, yeah.
I've been programming these things for 18 years, so I've built up quite an ability so that if you say, oh, is there a macro for such and such, we can look in the macro menu and see what's there. I can't remember what's there. No way. But we can look in the macro menu. If there isn't one in the macro menu, then I can produce one because I enjoy doing that. And by asking me to do it, that then goes into the macro menu, and then other people can benefit from that particular macro that you wanted. And if you wanted it, then it may well be that other people will want it. So yeah, so please ask me. I'm retired as well. I've stopped full-time paid editing, so I've got loads of free time. Happy to create more macros.
Yeah, so Duncan asked about if we need to turn on the developer option in our toolbar, and no, you don't. And I apologize that we didn't have time to really go into more detail today. We are happy to come back and do another class, like a hands-on workshop where we lead people through installing macros on their computer and assigning them keyboard shortcuts and giving them time to practice with macros on their own while we're here to answer questions and get them unstuck. But no, you don't need to put the developer tab on your toolbar. And if you look in the macros from square one guide, that gives you all the instructions for installing macros, and there's screenshots, and so it should be fairly straightforward. Yes, and yes, Marissa, all of Paul's macros are free to use. They're in the macro menu. And if you just click on the macro name, it pulls up the macro code where you can just copy and paste it right there to install into Word. How much time do we have left, Duncan?
Well, we've still got like 8 or 9 minutes until the hour, if anyone has any more questions.
Well, I know Paul had something he put together. I think we have time for that, Paul, do we?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Just a little mini demonstration.
Yeah, so great.
Share screen to share. Am I there?
Yep.
Can you see my screen? Yeah. This is just something I sort of produced earlier. The idea of be an obsessive time saver. Look after the small things, and that can really help in the web because they add up together. It may only save a few seconds. So is it worth it? Well, you multiply by the number of times you're using it. So you want to think, what am I doing a lot? And if you're doing it a lot, then look to see if there's a macro. You've already seen Google Fetch. I mean, that is the one that a lot of people say, oh yes, that's saved me a lot of time. The other point about it is, because it's very quick to look something up with Google Fetch or whichever fetch it is you're using, you are more likely to do the checking. So in other words, you think, oh, I wonder about, I haven't got time to check that. If it's very quick to check it, then you are more likely to actually, oh, I'll just check it, click, and you check it. So that's another advantage. So look at what you do often and decide what it is that you're actually doing so often. And then use, if you can, use a keystroke, because we've said about RSI, you can cut down RSI by using keystrokes rather than the mouse. So that's my plea for that. I had one occasion where for an hour and a half, I did some very, very intensive mousing. I was on a train, bouncing about. I was gripping the mouse. The following day, my elbow was absolutely, terrible. And it was from that. And, it took a year before I got rid of that pain in my elbow, or 9 months maybe, but just from 1 hour and a half intensive mouse use. So please think about it. And I would say, actually, if there's a single keystroke, as opposed to holding a control key down or a command key or an alt key and then doing it, use the F key. And then, of course, obviously, if there's you can use a macro through a keystroke, because there are some things that you can use on just by an F key. I'm sure you know that with spell checking, you can use F7 to do the spell checking. So that's just one press of one key. And when your hands are on the keyboard already, just add it, just pressing an F key is very quick. So suppose, what have we got? Yeah, so I've got a sentence, and those 3 words are ones that are, how do you spell those? Is that right? Perately or parately? So you can double click it to select it, and you can press F7, and that will take you to the proofreading, and it says, we're finished checking your selection. Do you want to go to the rest of the document? Well, to the next, we have to get rid of that. You press either the no key, the no button, or the X button. But actually, there is a single key press you can use to get rid of that box. And this applies to a lot of Word things. This is nothing to do with macros. This is just getting used to what you can do with Word. A single key press, click. How did I get rid of it? I pressed the escape key. The escape key will often get rid of the on-screen window, which can be quite useful. However, the next B is use a macro. So what I'm typing, I see desperately, with a single key press, I get a bleep to tell me that word is correct. What about this one? Bleep, single, that's correct. Bleep, yes, that's correct. But suppose it was that, I click in there and press it, and it doesn't bleep at me because it wasn't correct, but it has corrected it. So that's quite useful, especially when you're typing. Yes. And also I tend to go all press the F key again, and it changes the capitalization as well. So not only does it check the spelling, but it also checks for double capitals. I better stop. I had some. Oh no, I will just show you this. So I am really obsessive. So I go click, 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 and it doesn't change cos, but it does change the alpha. So that's using a macro that just runs along the line, finds a variable or variables. So B and C are both variables, so it changes those for one click. Yeah, I told you I was obsessive, so that's me. I hope that seeds some
That's
ideas.
Great. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, that's
Any other
fantastic.
Any other last questions?
Between the webinar and the chat and all the links, there is an awful lot of documentation, tips, and things to actually try. And yeah, like you said, Jennifer, maybe we will have to invite you back once everyone's actually, practiced and tried out some of these, and then we'll have even more questions, many more questions from actually implementing lots of macros. And
yeah, we'd love to do that. We do that for many editing organizations where we do like a hands-on workshop teaching people how to use them. And 'Cause sometimes, you know, some people are gonna take that macro from a square one document and zoom and be fine, and they're gonna do it. But then other people, rightly so, myself included, when I got started, you know, needed a little more assistance, and so we're happy to.
It's the very first step. It's getting that very first macro into your computer. That is the biggest hurdle of all. Once you've got over that, then adding another macro and another macro and another one is relatively easy. But I don't underestimate the difficulty of getting the idea of putting a macro in and getting to use it. That does take some effort, and we will help you.
Yeah, and I put our email addresses in the chat as well, so if you feel free to contact either of us in the future if you have questions.
Yeah, thank you. And again, as we've mentioned, all of the links and URLs will be included in the follow-up emails to everyone about this session, and included kind of with the video when we post it, so they'll all be immediately accessible to anyone that watches this recording again in the future. We'll keep it all together, so people don't have to go hunting around the internet.
Yeah, there's a lot of links we threw at you, so it'll all be organized in the handout.
Yeah, so I guess that brings us to the end at the end of the session. Thank you so much for that. My brain is buzzing a bit with the amount of things to try. So yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Paul. That was brilliant. And yeah, lots of great comments in the chat, and people keen to get stuck into using macros. So yeah, thank you for that. And thanks everyone for participating, all your questions and chat. We shall see you at the next webinar on peer review at the end of May. So thanks everyone. Have a good week.
Thank you.
Okay,
See you again
thanks.
soon.
Bye.